I just want to let you know I just have published in ebook form my first book. Basically, it's called What is the Trinity? The thing is, people generally do not know. The working title of the book was 10 Steps Towards Becoming Less Confused About the Trinity, but I decided that was not a good title. But what it is, it's a book that you should be able to give to a Trinitarian friend, and which hopefully should be useful to you too, because it doesn't do a frontal assault on the Trinity. It just says, look, here's where it comes from, here's what the different Trinitarians think. The Trinity is not one theology. The Trinity is a disorderly gang of somewhat related theories. And really they're saying different things. And so this is an attempt to get people to understand some of the history and some of the different views that are out there. So I hope it'll be helpful. It's out in the place that you probably buy ebooks right now. It'll be out in June in paperback and audiobook if you're interested in that. So my talk today is called Clarifying Catholic Christologies. Catholic with a small c. So this is any mainstream type of Christianity that acknowledges the ecumenical councils, or at least maybe the first 4 of them. And I could have also called it Christology through stick figures, or would the real Jesus please stand up? But I'm going to cover an absurdly large bunch of history here and try to do it in an understandable way. And I'm not really kidding about the stick figures, as you'll see. So one of the main points I'm making is that because of Catholic theorizing about Jesus, certain terms have become ambiguous. Like you don't know what they're supposed to refer to, because they could refer to several different things. What terms? Well, important terms like Jesus, Son of God, Christ. As you'll see by the end of this presentation, there are like 5 different supposed things that these could refer to. And that's kind of appalling. It's confusing. And so I'm going to tell you what those 5 things are and make an attempt to sort out the language. And if this gives you a big enough headache, maybe you'll reconsider Christology and want to revisit the Bible on the whole topic. So to talk about just ambiguous terms, supposedly somebody refers to Trump's kid. I bet you didn't think you were going to see a frowning picture of Donald Trump today, did you? Suppose someone refers to Trump's kid. Who's that? Right, it's an ambiguous term. Could be this lady, could be this confused kid, could be someone that's not real, that doesn't exist. Right? Someone made up some story about Buford, and there is no Buford Trump. Right? So it'd be better to sort out the terms and have unambiguous terms so that we actually know who we're talking about. So once upon a time, there was a man named Jesus of Nazareth, and he did ordinary human things such as eating, sleeping, and talking, and he did supernatural things like raising the dead, forgiving sins, walking on the water. How could this be? Okay, so I'm using the red arrow for divine actions, and the blue is for the human actions. Anytime you see a man-type figure in this, it means a self, okay? Obviously, if you believe in Jesus and you think that he's God's Messiah, God's anointed one, you also have to believe in God. There's the anointed one, and there's the God who anointed him. And an obvious explanation for this man's supernatural powers is that God was in him. God's working through him. God has empowered him by his Spirit. In his ministry, he's following God's lead. He's doing miracles. God is doing miracles and sending out divine teaching through this man. So in this story, there are 2 characters, 2 main characters. There's Jesus and his God. And our God. There are 2 selves. There's one human self and there's one divine self. Where's the Holy Spirit? Well, Jesus is supposed to be filled with the Holy Spirit. Look at Luke chapter 4 at the start of his ministry. He says, the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, etc. So that's where the Holy Spirit is. It's not an additional person. At least that's not how it seems when you read the first 3 Gospels. Now, if you want a name for this Christology, I'm going to take a derogatory name and just use it anyway, like people sometimes do. That's actually where, Christian was probably a derogatory name when they first came out with it. We're like, yeah, that sticks. We'll call ourselves Christians. The old derogatory term for this that goes back to the 100s is philanthropism. And this is from the Greek terms for mere man. This is a mere man Christology. The people who gave this name, they thought this was an impoverished view of Jesus. Oh, there's got to be more. He can't just be a mere man, because a mere man couldn't do all the stuff he did. Well, you should read the Old Testament. Mere men do some pretty amazing things. Mere men part the Red Sea and know about the future and speak first person on God's behalf and all kinds of amazing things. But anyway, where do you see this mere man Christology? On the face of it, you see it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's just right there. You got God, and you got Jesus. God is somebody else. Jesus talks to him. God says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him," etc. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't seem to think that the idea of a man who's empowered by God is boring, or that he's just another prophet or just a spiritual guy like a guru or something. They seem to think that it's a pretty big deal to be God's Messiah. In fact, it was a bigger deal than the Jews, a lot of them, really expected it would be. They just expected he would be a king of Israel, right? And they didn't really understand that he was going to be the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. So, look, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote the way they did, we know that this was a mainstream Christian view in the second half of the first century. If they thought that Jesus created the world, they probably would have said so. In fact, Jesus probably would have took credit for it too, wouldn't you? Oh, by the way, did I ever mention I created the world? I mean, don't tell anybody because I don't want to get in trouble, but anyway, they don't mention this, right? There's no pre-existence, no creating the world. As far as they're concerned, that's how the gospel starts. Mark just jumps right into the start of his ministry. He doesn't even talk about the virgin birth. I don't think that's an impoverished message. Now, what about the rest of the New Testament? All right, well, here we get into controversy, and I'm not going to settle the controversy today. Do you also have a mere man Christology in John? I think you do, but a lot of people don't. Do you have it in Paul? I think you do, but a lot of people think you don't. This is a chronological problem, right? Because at this same time, the 40s, 50s, and 60s, if Paul is teaching that Jesus created the world and that he always existed, why do these gospel writers just ignore that? I mean, they're clashing messages at this time. But anyway, I'm not going to settle these disputes. I understand there are a number of passages that people look at and they think, oh, that's got to be pre-existence. And there's a small handful of passages they look at and they think, well, that's trying to say the pre-human Jesus created. Yeah, I understand that. I think after this presentation, you might see a little bit why people are inclined to take it that way. When you come to a text with a theory, you're eager to find that theory in the text. And anyway, I'm a philosopher. I'm going to talk about these theories. So I'm not going to settle all these biblical arguments. Okay, so once upon a time, we had the human Messiah empowered by God and his God. Two characters in the story, one divine, one human. Now it gets more complicated. So we have to talk about logos theory. Logos theory goes back to the famous Greek philosopher Plato, who lived in the 300s BC. And he wrote this book called the Timaeus, which is a strange dialogue. And in the Timaeus, one of the characters gives this long, convoluted cosmology, this story, this myth about how all things came to be. And in the myth, the ultimate source, not exactly God, but anyway, the ultimate origin of all things, for some reason, which never really gets explained, he's so transcendent that he just absolutely cannot create directly. So he has to have an in-between. He has to have an intermediary who's neither created nor uncreated. So this gets developed by people like Philo of Alexandria, the Hellenized Jewish Bible commenter who's living around the time of Jesus, but in Alexandria. And they start coming up with the following theory, which is popular by the middle of the 100s. So in eternity, God has within him his logos. That's like his reason or his wisdom. And so, but it's just a divine attribute. It's like a thought. But then when it's time to create, he cannot, for some reason, directly create. He's too transcendent for all that, don't you know? And so he has to speak out this internal divine word and make it a being alongside him. And so they literally call this a second God and another God. It's a lesser God. It's a lesser divine being. It's not the same kind of God that the monotheistic one God is, but it's a divine being which existed before creation. And so this logos, through this logos, God creates the cosmos. He can't do it directly. Only this logos, for some reason, can get his hands dirty. And this was a type of speculation that was popular in Platonism in the first 2 centuries of Christianity, but it went back to Plato from even before that. I mean, to use a bad movie analogy, God's the producer and the logos is the director. There's 2 creators. There's the ultimate source of everything, and then there's the one that actually kind of directly does it. All right, what does this have to do with Jesus? Okay, John chapter 1. The Logos theorists thought that they found these teachings in John 1. And fortunately or unfortunately, John uses the word Logos. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was divine, or the Logos was God. And then it goes on to say that God made everything through the Logos. Now, personally, I think if you just look at the Old Testament, it says God made everything through his word. I don't think it is pushing Logos theory, but anyway, that's how people looked at it. So when they looked at this, they said, okay, it's saying that even before creation, God had a buddy, the Logos, who was with him in fellowship, and then he only made things indirectly through this Logos. And this Logos was a God. Was not the one God, but another guy, a lowercase g God. That's how they read it. So God made all things indirectly in that way. And then John, as you know, John 1 goes on in verse 14, it says, the Word became flesh and dwelled among us. And so they said, okay, well, this must mean that this pre-existent spirit, this lesser divine spirit, took a flesh, whatever that is, and somehow became a man by that. And there's something strange about Logos theorists in the 100s. They think it's really easy to detect what kind of being is by its actions. Now this is going to get you in trouble with Moses, right? Moses parts the Red Sea, and that's a miracle. And you say, well, who can do miracles but God alone? Well, I guess Moses is God incarnate. No, that's crazy talk, right? Because God can empower prophets. He can empower a mere man to do these amazing things, right? But so they thought, well, if you just look at the actions, you can tell which being those actions are coming from very easily. And so the human actions are coming from the flesh, whatever that is, and the divine actions are coming from this second divine being, the Logos. Now, I mean, look at what I've got on the screen. I got these 2 stick figures. There's a divine and a human one. But if you see the man Jesus, what do you see? You see something kind of like this up here. 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, 1 torso. Are we really going to think that there's 2 beings walking around there? Is there really a man and then like this indwelling lesser deity? What is this, like a case of possession or something? It's strange, right? So what some of them did is they said, yeah, actually it's not a man, it is a body. So in other words, they read the Word became flesh, and they say the Word took on a body. Okay, so again, there's the difference between this. Here we have a human self, and here we have just a human body. Or maybe there's a soul there, but it's like not doing anything. Some of them thought that it was kind of just there, deactivated somehow. They're always unclear about this, these type of people. The type of people who have a human nature, human flesh, but they don't think it's a human self. They're always kind of weaselly on whether they think there's a soul there or not. Okay, so this looks like too many Jesuses, basically. You got this hidden inner, eternal, or maybe at least pre-existent, divine Jesus. Then you got this man. Well, that's 2 Jesuses. There's only supposed to be 1, right? There's the only Son of God. Well, this is one way to pare it down back to 1. You just say, well, it's only a body. All right. So instead of having a normal, and they're all assuming dualism at this time, basically. Instead of a normal human soul, the Logos takes the place of a human soul, is the idea. Now, of course, you still got God in the picture. That's not the Logos. The Logos is a lesser divine being, right? This is what gets forgotten. If you hear apologists say things like, Christians have always thought that Jesus is God. This is pig ignorant, okay? Now, you'll see there are a couple of views I'm going to show you that you could describe them as that Jesus is God. Okay, but look at this one. Is Jesus God? No, there's a God involved. This looks like a lesser God puppeting a body. But there's also the one God there, the unique highest God. So to say that this is teaching Jesus as a God is just, it's confusing at best, okay? Okay, so you got God. He's still in the picture. He's still a person, a self. And then you've got a lesser divine being. So you got two divine beings, but it looks like you've got no human being. Well, that ain't right. We don't want to be Docetists, right? Like those dastardly Gnostics, at least some of the dastardly Gnostics. This is a story that involves two selves. There's God, and then there's his divine assistant who goes on this mission, takes on a body, and does all this stuff. You could call this a God and a bod Christology, as long as you make sure you have a lowercase g on that, so we're clear that's the Logos and not God that we're talking about, right? Earlier people, they think that God waited until it was time to create and then he spoke out the Logos, so it's not even eternal. It just came into existence just a little while before creation. A less humorous name for this is a word flesh Christology, because you've got the Logos and you've got a body. Again, maybe a deactivated soul, it's not clear. Okay, so many theologians from the late 2nd century through the 4th century held this type of view. And indeed, some still do, I think. There are people who think that Jesus was just God or a second God, one of the two, in a body. Sometimes they'll even compare the incarnation to an avatar, which this is more like an avatar idea from Hinduism. So many held this view in the early times, and some still do. In the 4th century, this comes to be called a one nature view. And the reason they called it that was they thought that when the Logos combines with this flesh, whatever that is, that they kind of melded together to make one being. In this context, nature basically means a being. You're a human nature. I'm a human nature. God is a divine nature. It just means being, okay? So if they say it's a one nature view, it means the Logos became flesh, but that's really one entity, is what they're trying to say. Wait a second. There's too few humans. We had too many Jesuses before, a divine and a human Jesus, but now we got 0 humans, it looks like. Right, so what happened to the man that we started with? Why would you think that a human body that's indwelled by an ancient divine being is a real man? Okay, now play with me. I know that many of you are not dualists, okay, but play with me, pretend like you are for a second. So you think that you can exist outside your body, all right? Now suppose this angel gets naughty one day. He's looking at your body. He says, that's a pretty nice looking body. I want to try that on. He kicks your soul out and takes your body. Or suppose a demon does this, okay? Maybe an angel wouldn't do this because God wouldn't want this. But so a demon comes along, get out, that's my body now, kicks your soul out. Now you're just floating around. Man, what happened? I'm disembodied, okay? And then suppose the demon just keeps your body for the rest, for the rest of as long as the body can keep going. Would he become a man by doing that? Would that be a part of the human race? I would say no. That would become a demon puppeting a body. Remember that intelligent gorilla, Coco, that new sign language? It had a kitten. They called the kitten All Ball. And then it learned like 200 words of sign language, this big lowland gorilla named Coco. That was pretty smart, smart as some toddlers maybe in some respects. So, right, again, imagine dualism is true. Imagine they could, a mad scientist can put you in a machine, strap you down to a table, put the gorilla on the table next to it, some sci-fi stuff happens, and imagine they could literally transfer the gorilla's soul into yours and maybe put yours in the gorilla, Right? So you'd wake up and you'd be like, what happened, man? Like, you'd be really disturbed. Well, I guess you wouldn't be able to talk. You'd just be grunting or something. But then, now, right, if Coco the gorilla's soul is in your body, has Coco become a man or a woman? I don't think so. That's not part of the human race. That's not part of the human lineage. That's not a member of your family. Right? That's not your parents' daughter or son, right? It's just they've taken apart a human in the way dualists understand it. They've taken it apart, and out of one of the leftovers, now there's this kind of puppety thing going on. All right. So it's not at all clear that if you take this eternal divine being that created the world and you stick it in a body, that you get a real man, as opposed to just something that kind of looks like a man from the outside. You got to have this guy, right? Jesus has got to be a real human being because Jesus died a real human death. You have to have a human life to give it up. He let others take his human life for him. A divine being is probably going to be immortal, right, like God, and isn't going to have a human life to die. You could maybe destroy its body. Right? Go back to my demon that took your body, that thieving demon. Right? If somebody runs you down, they don't kill a human, right? They destroy the body. The heart stops pumping, the brain stops working, everything, lungs stop breathing. But the demon presumably just floats right out of the whole thing. He's like, well, that was fun. I'm going to do that again. Maybe pick a better body next time. Get me a movie star or something. I don't know. But Jesus, he can't just be, they killed my body and I'm perfectly fine. My life is just going to continue going on. He's a real human. He really died. He died a human death. He didn't just experience death, like sometimes people want to say. He actually died. Experiencing death and dying are not the same thing. I could put you in some kind of death simulator. They got a new ride at Six Flags. It's a death simulation. I'm not sure why you'd want to do this, but it maybe be a pretty unpleasant ride. But if you'd walk out, right, you wouldn't actually die. Experiencing death isn't the same thing as dying. Dying is losing your normal capacities, or all of them, or most of them. If the puppet show's over, that's one thing, but dying is different. Okay, so Jesus has got to be truly human, and in fact, the New Testament strongly emphasizes this, probably because, as we'll hear later from Mr. Chandler, there were people even in the first century who were kind of suggesting that he's some kind of divine being and not a real human. Okay, now some Logos theorists, I'm talking late 100s, early 200s, they saw this problem. And so they said, actually, the word assumes a man. Actually, it was a whole man. We say a human nature, yeah, but by that we mean a man. So now there are three characters in the story. There's God, there's this lesser divine being, and there's a real man. Some call this a word-man Christology. Who held to this? A bunch of people. It was very popular, particularly in Eastern Greek-speaking Christianity. I'm talking about the elite theologians, okay? As far as the people on the ground, I'm not really sure. The evidence is sparse, right? You have people popping up in the middle of the 300s who hold our view, who hold the view that Jesus just came into existence when he was conceived. There's a bishop of Antioch that holds that, and all his people, presumably. So anyway, but among the elite theologians whose writings have survived, this was a popular view. And eventually it comes to be called a two-nature view. And by that it means that there are two beings. There's the man and then there's the Logos. They don't combine to make one thing. So what's going on in the incarnation, in Jesus' ministry? You've got like two guys there, two cells, and they're cooperating with one another. They're kind of joined at the hip. I've compared it to internal Siamese twins. The internal Siamese twins are the human soul of Jesus and this Logos. And they're just like buddies, and they do stuff. And Theodore of Mopsuestia says that they have a moral union. In other words, they just willingly cooperate with one another. Origen, he goes to town and comes up with this wild story about the preexistence of the human soul. So he thinks all of your souls pre-existed. And some of our souls were naughty and some of them were nice. And that affects why people are born into different circumstances. It's a kind of a reincarnation idea. And the nicest of all of the disembodied pre-existent souls, the very nicest one was this one that was going to become the human soul of Jesus. And so even before creation, the Logos and the soul of Jesus become pals. And then he's born, he becomes a man, and they're still just cooperating. So he really did think there are two beings there. There are two sons of God. There's the pre-existent one, and there's the one that was born to Mary. And it's just that they kind of look like one. But look, looks like it's just obviously too many sons, right? How many unique sons of God? Oh, well, that question answers itself. How many unique sons of God are there in the New Testament? What could the answer to that be? Now, the leading scholar Origen, you got to love him and hate him. He's kind of a goofball. He's clearly brilliant. He's the first person that came up with textual criticism to compare different Greek and Hebrew manuscripts together. But like all philosophers, he's completely full of baloney sometimes. And I say that as a philosopher, so I'm allowed to say that. He thought he had a solution to this. He said, well, look, they're so united and so, in agreement, basically, with one another, that you can call the one the other. So you can call the eternal one Jesus of Nazareth, and you can call Jesus the Logos, or the Word, or the eternal Son. And he was, I think, I'm not sure about this, but I think Origen is the first one that came up with this ridiculous communication of idioms doctrine, which in any other field would just be considered kind of, I don't know, a joke or something. The idea is that communication of idioms means because of this mystical, unique union between the eternal Logos and this human nature, because of that union, whatever it is, nobody really knows, is the usual view. Because of that union, you can apply terms that really strictly apply only one to the other. So you can call the eternal Logos a man. I mean, it's not a man. It never got born in the normal way. And you can call the man an eternal divine being. It's not, it's a man, right? So, but it's this kind of authorized double talk, basically. I mean, look, I'm in a mystical union. I've been married for almost 25 years. I'm in a mystical union with my wife, right? And but that does. What if I told you that because of this mystical union, that the terms that apply to her could also be applied to me, and vice versa? So you could truly say about Dale that he's a cute little lady with a nice figure. You could say that, people would think you're an idiot, right? And you could say about my wife that she's a pasty guy with a goatee. No, I mean, look, this is just confusion masquerading as profundity. So that was Origen's solution. I'm not impressed. Look, if you've got too many Jesuses, it's no good to give off this smokescreen, well, we'll just call them both Jesus. We'll just call them both the Son of God. And we'll just call them both the Word. I mean, that's just sweeping a big pile of dirt under a carpet and making a big lump, right? So, not impressed with that. Guess what? A lot of other people weren't impressed. And I'm talking mainstream Christians that were in the mainstream, not Gnostic or some kind of offshoot group in the developing tradition that was going to become the bishop-ruled mainstream of Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. And a lot of people did not like this Logos theory. And we know this because some of the main Logo theorists, Tertullian and Origen, tell us this. They say the common folk, the herd, the unwashed masses, most of us, said, hey, you've got too many gods and too many creators in this scheme. Remember, there's two creators. There's an indirect and a direct one. And God had to first pop out this Logos, although Origen changed that to eternal generation. Just, it always was that God is somehow giving existence to this other one. And well, how does that work? Well, nobody knows. It's a mystery, is the right answer. So logos theory, you got two creators, you still have one God in the sense that one ultimate source of everything, but there are two divine beings, that's true. And these monarchians said, look, doesn't the Bible straightforwardly say that the one God made the heavens and the earth, and he did it unassisted? So in Genesis 1, he says, let us make man in our image and likeness. And seemingly, commenters now think that he's talking to his heavenly court, to his angels that attend him, so to speak, in his throne room. So he says, let us do this, but then he proceeds to do it by himself. And we know that because it uses singular verbs. When it says Yahweh made humans in his image and likeness. So, and he says in other places that he did it. And now if you ask, what about those couple of passages in Paul which people read as saying that the pre-human Jesus, or the divine element in him at any rate, that created the cosmos? Well, evidently, these people that are called monarchians by history, they didn't read it that way. Now, they had Paul, we know that, but apparently they didn't read some of these passages like Colossians 1 as involving pre-existence or somebody else other than God creating the world. How did they read them? Good question. They also had John 1, and evidently they didn't read that as, God had to create through this assistant, basically. How did they read it? Well, I think you'll see in a second. They thought that in eternity, some of these monarchians, the ones that historians call dynamic monarchians, they thought that in eternity the Logos was something like God's wisdom or reason, and it's by his wisdom that he made all things, right? Proverbs chapter 8, where wisdom is personified like a lady. But then God, as it were, made his word flesh. That is, God's eternal wisdom was expressed in the life of this real man. To become flesh is not literally to gain a body, like a ghost grabbing a body or something. To become flesh is for God's eternal wisdom, by which he made all things, to live through and be expressed in and communicated through this man. So again, they have God being the source of Jesus' supernatural abilities. What's the Logos of John 1? They think it's this power that's in Jesus that's expressed through him. So they don't think the Logos is a divine being. They think it's just God's, it's a divine attribute and divine action, basically. So they've gotten rid of the second God. There's one human self and there's one divine self here. And these views seem to have been very popular, I think, in reaction against the Logos theory in the late 100s and in the early 200s. But at least by the time we get to the end of the 200s, for reasons that are unclear to me, Logos theory seems to have kind of won out. At least at the level of elite theologian bishops, the Logos theory of the type Origen held is more popular than this. Although you still got these types of people around, and you still got people who say the Logos is not a second deity. Okay, it gets a little more complicated though. Sorry about that. So the word-man Christology is still around. Origen, honestly, they're a little bit idolatrous about Origen. They think he's such a wonderful man that they start adopting views just because this great man held them, and now the thinking is turned off when that happens. You should never treat any philosopher like that. We're useful, but you should, not for that, okay? And again, on this scheme, God and his Logos are two beings. So historians call that, eventually they start to call this is a newer term, they call it a duo-hypostatic theology. So hypostasis is another Greek term that just, in this time, hypostasis means being. So it's duo-hypostatic just means that God and his Logos are two different beings. That's what that means. Okay, so there's God, his Logos, and eternally God generates the Logos, and then at a certain point in time, the Logos enters into some relation. Well, let's see. In Origen's view, they became pals, like I said, in prehistory, before creation. But anyway, a body is taken on, and you have a complete human in the first century, finally. All right. Yeah, but look, we're back to the whole two Jesuses problem, right? You got two Jesuses here. You can only see one of them, but you got two of them. when you read the New Testament, they're only one character, right? Like, think of a demon-possessed person. They're like, help me, and then, no, you can't help him. Help me, help me. You can tell, like, when the voices change, right? And that's how you know there's two selves there. There isn't anything in Jesus like that. You know, there isn't with Jesus, he talks like in a normal American accent, so he's a regular guy. And then he puts on this really high-class British accent. Oh, that's the Logos. Sounds like Anthony Buzzard. No, there's nothing like that, right? He doesn't suddenly start using good grammar or something like that. And then he goes back to slang. Okay, that's the man again. No, there's no clue of this, right? It's all one guy. It's all one character. Okay, so there was a reaction against this. There were people who wanted to say that God and his Logos are one hypostasis, one nature. Now, we're getting up almost to the time of Nicaea now. God and his Logos are not two beings, not two hypostases. The Logos is in eternity God's attribute, and then at the right time he expresses it, and it's God's action, and that's when the Word becomes flesh. But it's really just becomes flesh. So they don't think that there is a human man here. They think there's either only a body or there's a body and some kind of deactivated soul that's not actually doing anything. Okay, so this is a view that was popular around the time of Nicaea in 325. They're starting to push back against Origen. They realize that people are being kind of idolatrous with Origen, and they start pushing back what they think is a more coherent view. Some theologians have called this a God, a capital G, God and Abad Christology, because there's no lesser deity here. There's God, and then God is basically puppeting this body. Now, this is what a lot of people think, okay? But it's a docetic view. He's not a real man then if this is what happened. He just got God, and when the time is right, he puts on this outfit of flesh, and then he goes and does some neat things. And that's what they thought. A famous proponent of this is named Marcellus of Ankara. That's Ankara, Turkey, in modern times. And he was a very influential guy at the Council of Nicaea in 325. And after that council, I'm not going to go into that, it says that the Father and the Son are one ousia, one essence, whatever that means. And the Son they're talking about really is the Logos. They kind of lost interest in the man Jesus to a large extent at this time. And when people saw this new formula from Nicaea in 325 that said the Father and the Son, that is the Logos, are one essence, they thought it was saying this, that there's really just one being there, which is just God, and then God is doing stuff through a body. And so after the Council of Nicaea, a lot of people thought it was saying this, and all the Origenists did not like it because it was contrary to their traditions. And look, there's a lot of reasons not to like this. In the Bible, Jesus talks to God and God talks back. You got to have two characters there. There's only one character here. And so when Jesus is praying, is that like God talking to himself or something? It looks bad, right? You don't have to be an Origenist to dislike this or a partisan of the old Logos theory to dislike it. Now, what basically happened was a series of councils squashed this rival approach. And the Council of Nicaea in 325 invented a new way of settling theological arguments. Here's how you win the argument, okay? You get an emperor-backed council to rule against the other guys, and then you hope that the emperor uses the might of his empire to shut the other guys up. Now, not only the Nicenes did this, but the other side did it as well. So it was dirty all around. But look, this is not really winning an argument. This is shutting other people up, is what it is. And also, it's not just secular power that's involved. Another thing that's involved is you're constantly pigeonholing everybody as, oh, well, that's just the same old garbage we heard before. Right now, this is still done. Oh, you're a Socinian, bleh, you know. Like as if that's that's an objection. Like, what if Socinus was right? Okay, so they get lazy in this period, and it becomes very fashionable to just denounce things as, oh, that's just so-and-so, we dealt with that before. And so a series of councils ruled against the mia-hypostatic view. They said it's just ye old Sabellian heresy. And these are the people that supposedly said that the Father was crucified. Sabellius is an obscure figure, but he's a monarchian from the early 200s, the mid-200s. Oh yeah, we've heard this before, but that's bad. We ruled against that. Right? Then you don't have to think about it anymore. And so they basically pigeonholed Marcellus and his crew as just revived Sabellian heresy. So great, we dealt with that, right. And as far as the other monarchian views, or the philanthropist view, where Jesus is a mere man, they said, well, that's just the old heresy of Paul of Samosata. Again, he was a monarchian guy. He probably thought the logos of John 1 was God's power or something like that, God's action. Again, he's a very obscure figure, but he got voted down by a meeting of bishops in the year 269. Okay, so in the mid-300s, like, yeah, we already dealt with that, whatever, losers. And they just moved on. And they pressured Marcellus into changing his theology too. Yet another council comes along. I'm summarizing a lot of history here, in the year 381, and says for the first time officially that there's one God in three persons. I mean, I think they implied that. They don't say it exactly that way, because they don't say that the Spirit is one essence too. But so basically you have your first Trinitarian council in 381. And I hate to tell you this, but this makes the whole Christology more complicated. So in the 3 and 400s, you got the one nature people who think that the eternal Logos combines somehow with a body, or maybe a body and a soul, to make one being. That's what they mean by one nature. And so you still got the two nature people who think that there's really are two beings there. There's a man, and then there's this lesser God, basically. Another emperor steps in and decides to end this long ongoing dispute between the one nature and the two nature people. This is at Chalcedon in the year 451. They famously say that you've got to say that Jesus, or that Christ, is one person in two natures. What does that mean? Nobody really knows. Theologians now will tell you that they were safeguarding the mystery by telling you what to say. But what to say doesn't tell you what to think. And basically they forcibly shut down the argument. And they said there aren't, and you're not allowed to make any more creeds about whether Christ is one nature or two natures. They did insist that the two natures are complete, which suggests that there's got to be a body and a soul in the human nature. Now, how does this relate to the triune God? Okay, well, the Logos is supposed to be one of those three persons. So now you got this kind of thing. You got the triune God, the Logos has somehow entered into a union so as to be one person, which is now a technical term that they kind of made up, stipulated that doesn't mean what you might think it means. And it's unclear how many characters you have here, right? Trinitarians are still trying to figure this out. How many selves are in the Trinity? Probably the majority would say one. There's like three personalities or something. But then the other Trinitarians, oh no, there's three persons here. It's like a family. And they got three. And then some Trinitarians, we have no idea. You really can't understand God. And if you ask how many persons, like you're assuming that you can understand God, and that's crazy. So you just say it's a mystery. Okay, so you're supposed to say, according to Chalcedon, that the eternal divine Logos mysteriously unites with a complete human nature, body and soul. Well, okay, that sounds like it's supposed to be a man, right? Normally, the dualist thinks that a complete body and soul compose a human being. Then they also end up saying that, well, it's man, but not a man. So they're saying that there's only one person here. The human nature is not a person. Okay, but this human nature does everything you think a person does. It dies on a cross. It's concerned about his mother. It gets hungry. It goes to sleep. They do think that the human nature does everything you think a human being does. But they've said that you're not allowed to call it a person because that would be too many persons. So is it a self? Is it a human self or not? Nobody knows, okay? Some think this and some think this, and that's just where we're stuck. It's still that way. Now, okay, who won, the one nature or the two nature people? Initially, they both went away mad. They both thought they had lost. As time went on, right, all that the council told them was what they were to say. As time went on, the two nature people liked it and kind of decided that it was okay. Initially, they were annoyed because they could no longer talk about two sons and two births and so on. Two different births for two different sons, the one in time and the one eternally. The one nature people never did like it, and they still don't like it. You can still find a few monophysites. Phusis is another word for nature or essence or being. So the monophysites are, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox who never did accept this 451 council. They're still mad about it. All right. Another innovation happened around this time. As far as I can tell, I'm not sure who the first person was to talk like this. They start talking about the incarnate Christ as one person who has two natures. Okay, so I have to make my chart more complicated. There's this guy. Right? Because look at this one. The human, that doesn't have two natures. The quasi-human, the human nature, that's not one person in two natures. The Logos is not one person in two natures. Okay, but now they're talking about Christ in one nature, seemingly like parts or components, like there's the divine, the human component. What? Where did this guy come from? We already had too many Jesuses, now we got an extra one. So now the terms Son of God, Jesus, and Christ have become very ambiguous. So let's just take the name Jesus. Who are we talking about? What alleged being out of this crowd do we mean when we say Jesus? Well, you might think, well, obviously we mean the man. Isn't he just by definition a man? You'd think so. The complete human nature, but it's understood to be a man. Oh, but maybe it's this eternal divine person. That's a different being, right? Or maybe it's the complete Christ, which has two natures. Oh, great. Now it's ambiguous between three, but it gets worse. I mean, some people, when they say that Jesus died on the cross, they think the human nature died on the cross, but that wasn't a man. So then when they just said Jesus died on the cross, they were talking about this thing. And thing is the right word. It's an it. It's not a he. It's not a self. Okay, but now this is the bottom of the barrel as far as confusion is concerned. But in these latter days, some people call the triune God Jesus. All right, so they get into a conversation, a Trinitarian gets into a conversation about Islam. They say, look, man, there's two gods here. You've got to choose. Are you going to believe in Allah or are you going to believe in Jesus? Okay, but they're Trinitarians. They mean the triune God. They just use the term Jesus for the triune God. Okay, now we're up to 5 things that could be meant. It's crazy, okay? It's enough to make you crazy, and it's even hard to discuss these things. So my title was Clarifying Catholic Christology. I'm going to give you different terms for these 5 different things in a second. Most of them are pretty obvious. Right, the same 5-way ambiguity would hold for Christ. Some people say Christ, they mean the Trinity. Human nature, man, composite with the two natures. What do you mean by Christ? Generally, they don't call the Trinity the Son of God. I guess that's good. That just sounds wrong, right? You want to call the triune God the Son of God, but they use the word Jesus and Christ like that. Now, why does this matter? Is this just some pedantic goofball scholar making fine distinctions? No, it matters because truth matters. And different things are going to be true and false depending on which of these you mean. If you say something like Christ is both divine and human, that could only really apply to that weird thing I got in pink there, right? Because none of those other things is divine and human. That is, has a divine nature and a human nature. If you say Christ is the God-man, you mean he has two natures? It's got to be that one. It can't be any of those others. Christ died for your sins? Well, that's got to be the man, right? You have to be a human being to have a human death. Couldn't be just the body. Couldn't be the Trinity. If you say Christ created the cosmos, they mean the Trinity or the eternal Logos when they say that, right? The man didn't create the cosmos. He didn't exist then. Or the thing in pink, the Christ with two natures, that wasn't around back then. Christ was born to Mary. Well, it must be one of these physical things. To be born requires that you get inside a woman and come out in a certain one or two ways, right? And so the Trinity can't do that, the Logos can't do that, but a man can, and maybe a body can, although he wouldn't be a proper son, really, wouldn't be a human being. Okay, so if you want to straighten it out, here's some clarification for you. If you want to have a conversation about this. Could we agree to call the man, if there is a man involved, Jesus? We could call this eternal divine person the Logos. That's traditional, right? And I'm not saying you have to believe in all these things. If you're going to have a coherent view, you're going to have to get rid of some of these things. You can't have both the man and the human nature in there if you're going to hold a traditional Christology. I think we should get rid of more than that, but anyway. We could call the thing with two natures the incarnate Christ. We could call this complete human nature, or the body, which isn't a self, we could call that the human nature. And the Trinity, well, let's just call that the Trinity, right? Let's not call it Jesus. That's just a confusion. It's not a man. Nobody thinks the Trinity is a man. Right, so we need to cull the herd here, people. It's overpopulated. Something's got to go here. We need a smaller cast to have a play that makes sense. And how are we going to do that? Remember this? This. Let's just go back to the Synoptic Gospels, right? This is easy to understand. You got a man, very special man, miraculously conceived, God's Messiah. No, not just any kind of ordinary prophet, not just an extraordinary dude. You got a human self and a divine self. Look, one step in culling the herd can be looking at biblical terminology, because a lot of the things I just said are not biblical terminology. Like this human nature just isn't there, right? Here's the biblical terminology. The human being is referred to as the man Jesus. Literally, sometimes explicitly said to be a man, mind you. We're not inferring this. The Son of God, the Messiah, the Christ, the mediator, our eternal high priest, the suffering servant in prophecy. In the New Testament, they call him the one Lord. That's opposed to the one, in addition to the one God, mind you. And then maybe there's a couple of passages where he's called God. Right? Almost all of these passages have translation problems and textual problems. But let me grant that a couple of times. Maybe in Hebrews 1 he's called God, okay? What do they call God in the Bible? Well, they call him Yahweh, Lord, God, God the Father. Jesus is God. That's like 5 times in there. The one true God. He's not supposed to be a man. He says, when am I a man that I'm going to change my mind? They call him the Almighty. They don't use that of Jesus or anybody else. Now, are there ambiguous terms here in the Bible? Yes, but it's not very confusing. Here they are. God, it almost always means the Father. It maybe means Jesus a couple of times. Not very confusing, all right? The Lord, this is a little more confusing because in the New Testament they've coined a new use for the word Lord, hakurios in Greek. In the Old Testament, they didn't want to say the name Yahweh because that's too holy to say, so they would substitute the Lord, among other things, in Greek. And they still do that in the New Testament sometimes when they quote the Old Testament. But they've invented a new usage of Lord based on Psalm 110:1, which, if you've ever heard Anthony Buzzard, you've heard him talk about this. Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. It's explicitly multiple times in the New Testament. This one Lord is the man who's raised and exalted to God's right hand and who will be put in charge of all things. Okay, so really not that confusing. There are a few confusing passages in Paul where you're not sure if he means God or Jesus when he says Lord, but it's really not a big deal. Very small degree of ambiguity here. Jesus, you don't get too excited about Jesus being called God, right? Because Jesus explicitly says that people other than God, humans, yes, can be called gods. Read John 10 and don't agree with Jesus' enemies. Agree with Jesus. He's a smart guy. Okay, so he'll help you out on that one. If you're thinking that just because somebody's called God, that must be because they're God or because they have a divine nature, that's just a mistake. You should look at the biblical uses of these God terms. Look, isn't the only way we're going to settle this to go back to the Bible? Don't we need further reformation to clarify this stuff? Here's just a humble suggestion for you. The way we get ourselves in trouble is we start speculating and we make inferences from what the Bible says. Now, we have to do that sometimes, okay? Any intelligent reader is going to make inferences from a text. But this is exactly how we get into trouble. If you're making inferences from the text and it actually clashes with what the text explicitly says, now we've got a problem, right? So everybody's got a clever theory now about how the gospel writers are sneakily implying that Jesus is really Yahweh himself. I'm not going to go into all these bad arguments. There's a bunch of them. But look, these gospel writers, all four of them, have an explicit, clear, repeated thesis that Jesus is the Son of God, comma, the Messiah. You don't want to get an alleged implication that contradicts the thesis statement that's explicit, okay? So we got to wonder about this and how it affects the present case of this herd of too many characters in the story. Right? On the face of it, you have the one God, you have the mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. And look, the Bible only explicitly mentions these two characters. The Logos is mentioned, yes. But the question is, what is the Logos supposed to be? And the dumb answer is, well, it's the Word of God. Okay, right, but what would a first century Jew have thought the Word of God is supposed to be? And, something like the divine wisdom or action through which he created everything. By the word of the Lord, he created the heavens, Psalm 33:6. That's not making a point about his having a helper. It's just that he spoke and it was done, basically. Like you see, let there be light in Genesis. Okay, so don't we just have two characters explicitly mentioned are the man Jesus, and that's just the same person as the Son of God, the Messiah, the Christ. And then you also have mentioned God the Father. Not mentioned the Trinity, the human nature of Christ, the composite Christ with two natures. Yeah, I know people think these are implied, but again, this is how we get ourselves in trouble, by clever deductions based on theories that we have in our minds. So, is the Logos a second divine being, or is it just what I said before? They didn't think it was obvious back in the 100s and the 200s, and even in the 300s. These monarchian type people, mainstream Christians, they were not down with this Logos as a second divine being idea. Are they right or not? The distressing thing is that in current day scholarship, they don't even consider other interpretations. If you look up a commentary on John 1, there ought to be a big argument in there with the monarchian type reading, battling against the Logos theory readings. It's not there. If you find it, I'm very impressed with your commentary, and you should share it with me. But generally, they just completely ignore it, or different interpretations of Colossians 1, for instance, or Philippians 2, that seem to talk about pre-existence to so many people. Okay, so the key issue here, and this is one of my final points, is do we really need Logos theory? We've totally forgotten about this idea that for some reason an omnipotent being can't directly create. Like, how could that be? Like, what, he's too holy or something? He has to have an intermediary that's neither created. They've even forgotten that in the mainstream. So they're actually saying that in the 100s and the 200s, but then they just forget about it. Why do we need this Logos theory? Do we need it? I don't think that we do. So my question for you is, what does the Logos do that can't be done instead by God and or his divinely empowered human Messiah? Because if the answer is nothing, then you can go back to that simpler view with two characters that we can all understand. All right, thanks a lot.